Hello, everybody. Welcome to this month's webinar, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Frameworks for TA Providers. We have a packed agenda with a lot of really amazing content that we're excited to share with you today. So we'll jump right in. Let me move on over to the next slide. For the agenda today, we'll go through some brief introductions of our amazing panelists who have worked a lot to put this presentation together and gather all this information and resources that we'll also be sharing out on the CMWS webpage on the mentoring website. We'll get into an overview of the DEI-AB lens, get into some discussion around critical mentoring before getting into the history of youth mentoring, and then dive right into some extra resources that everybody's compiled together before we close on out. Very excited to introduce our presenters today. We have Dwayne Bennett from Mentor Virginia, August Haven from Indiana Youth Institute, and Naomi Rodriguez from Mentor New York. And this presentation was also put together in partnership with one of our members from the National Mentoring Resource Center Youth Advisory Board, Kamal Amirneni. And I think at this point, I'll pass it over to Dwayne.
All right. Great day, everyone. My name is Dwayne Bennett, and we are going to have a fantastic webinar series today focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion with the youth mentoring frameworks. Now, from a standpoint of information, diversity, equity, and inclusion could be an area that has some sensitive issues, sometimes some terminology that some people are not used to or feel comfortable with. It's not an intention to cause any offense or to cause any challenges. It's just that we want to be as authentic as possible with our presentation. So we're going to use the terminology that is commonly used within this space. And as we move along, we'll all get better by being very authentic to the diversity, equity, inclusion area. Now, as you see on the screen, in the case diversity, equity, inclusion is a long game, one that requires nudges along the way. Julia Crass. What we're going to do today is start with the very general, right, with this general definition of diversity, equity, inclusion, and sometimes we can add on belonging, sometimes we can add on a J for justice. So it's an expansive definition. You can use it with your program, and then we're going to start to narrow it down till we get to this framework of how we can infuse diversity, equity, and inclusion into our mentoring programs, and then we're going to give some actual resources to do that. So it's going to be a great presentation today, and you'll get to know me and get to know August and Naomi a little more as we go along with our program. All right, here we go. Now, as we move to our definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's many definitions. I wanted to keep it as general as we could so that you can adopt the information that you need in your approach for your organization based on what its particular vision, its particular mission, its particular goals. So in general, when we're talking about diversity, we're just talking about all the ways that people differ. Any way a person differ, that's diversity. When we talk about equity, we're talking about really fairness. If we want to use one word under equity, we're talking about fair treatment, access to opportunities, advancements for who? For everyone, for all people. One's identity cannot predict the outcome. And if we're talking about inclusion, right, we're talking about a variety of people have power, right, a voice, and decision-making authority. Now, you can modify, and most people modify or use this definition expansively or narrowly, but we just wanted to give you enough to say, hey, our presentation is going to be centered around these three big themes as we move forward. All right. Now, some tips in terms of equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? It's a term to describe a program. Most of the time people see it through the lens of individuals, but it's a term to describe programs and policies. Diversity, equity, inclusion programs and policies that what we want to is to get the best out of us as human beings out of this planet by bringing everyone to the table to assist us as we make decisions concerning what's our goals, what's our dreams, what's our aspirations for our programs or individuals. Now, I love it for the fact that now we have some breakdown as to some diverse categories in terms of gender, races, ethnicities, abilities, disabilities, religions, cultures, ages, sexual orientations, people with diverse backgrounds, experiences, skills, expertise. And even with that, we probably left something out. So the key is this: diversity, equity, inclusion. It's all about differences, but it's also about how we can find the connection points in order to make our spaces better for everyone involved. Now, this first a couple of slides is to give you a framework. Here we go, for organizations in general to infuse or place diversity, equity, inclusion as a part of the organizational structure. How can we do that practically? I'm going to give you two frameworks. This first framework, as you see, we're adding belonging into our definition of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And when you look to the definition of belonging, then we're adding in that we want people to feel accepted as members of this group that we're involved in, that they can feel valued, that they can feel connected, and they can feel like they're a part of the company. Not that they are on the outside of the company looking in, but they're inside of the company looking around to be able to make an impact with that. So you can start anywhere on this diversity wheel, if you will, and you can use these, but use this particular framework as a way your company, if necessary, wants to become more diverse. How do you do that? DEI, starting to our right, your left, DEI is the base to build on. Then you focus on what's the purpose of the company, what's the first purpose on you interjecting diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, this is big right here. Accept that your company isn't for everybody. Okay, so from a company perspective, everyone may not fit into the focus of your diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging program. But on the other side, individuals, when you come into a company, you must realize also that this company may not be for you. So there's give and take, there's ebbs and there's flows, there's back, there's forth, but ultimately the company and the individual is looking to frame, right, their company in a way that makes it more diverse, right? It's got to be a conscious effort. It has to be led by example. That's getting what our leadership involved. And then we don't want to leave anyone out, right? We got people that work now remote. We got people that work by contracts. We got people that work seasonal. We want to not want to leave those people out. And then finally, we're going to be accountable. This is one framework that you can use to infuse, if you will, or enhance your company diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. We're going to move on to another framework. Now, this framework is more, I think we got a little more deep information on it, and we're taking a deeper dive as to our first framework, which is more of a general space. And as you can see, right, from the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that's the framework. A nuanced understanding of the causes. Number 2, meaningful definition of success. Number 3, accountable and invested business leaders. Number 4, design for context. And number 5, a rigorous tracking and course correction. Now we're looking at this horizontally, but it can also be set down vertically. It also can be a circle, right? But I just want to highlight a few things out of each particular area. Number 1, a nuanced understanding of root causes. Identify the root causes of why your company may not be diverse. Okay, understand the problem with a deep fact base, right? So it's first, why isn't your company diverse? Then you can go in the reverse, right? And figure out how I can infuse some of these concepts in our company. Then number 2, so important. Everything's right, so important, but you got to set clear and quantifiable aspirations, right? You got to set some goals. You got to set some benchmarks. You got to set some time frames so that you can measure your progress. Number 3, right? And this may be the key to all diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging programs and frameworks and if you will, opportunities to move, is to hold senior leaders accountable for outcomes, not just for inputs or activities. What does that mean? We can put a lot of things in place in our organization in terms of what we want employees to do, what we want our managers to do, what we want our leaders to do, but those are the input and those are activities. But the key is we want the outcomes that come from the input or activities by our benchmarks, by the things that we're looking at, by the dates, and then we can hold what leaders accountable. Number four, let me point out one thing out. Number four, it's the last thing in this area: equip and encourage employees to contribute. Diversity, equity, inclusion, right? It almost goes without saying, it can't be a program or a framework without the people that's involved in, without the diverse people involved in order to make the organization move forward concerning that. And finally, right, what are the key performance indicators? As we go forward, I'm going to point out a few key performance indicators, and you can use these KPIs as goals, you can use it as benchmarks, or you can look in as a way to frame your diversity, equity, inclusion program or endeavor. So those are two frameworks concerning diversity, equity, inclusion to infuse it into your organization in general. And now we're going to look at some key performance indicators. Statistics about diversity in the workplace. In 2021, 61,331 total workplace discrimination cases were filed with the EEOC. That's not good. Okay, so a key performance indicator is, as we look as a whole in this space, right, hopefully for 22, 23, 24, and then for the foreseeable future, that number of discrimination cases comes down from 61,000 to where the, well, I would say the end game, right, is zero, right? We ever get there, I don't know, but the key is trend in the right direction. All right, some things LGBTQ says 40% of LGBTQ workers have experienced unfair treatment. Here we go, that's not a definition. 49% of transition workers report being fired, not hired due to being trans. Again, that's part of our definition. 73% of Latinos in the U.S. Say skin color impacts their career progression. These are things we can use as benchmarks, you can use as KPIs as we look at our organization to formulate a strategy to make it more diverse. So these are some statistics, but pulling the statistics out, you can also use them as key performance indicators. What's the effect? Now this is a nuance in the space that sometimes we miss. And the nuance is that the company is putting diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging principles, inputs, activities in place because it's good business. It is good business for a company to have a diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging program and to make their culture diverse. Companies with inclusion cultures have 22% lower turnover and 30% higher customer satisfaction. So if you're keeping people in your company longer, then what? That equates to the bottom line. It's an economic impact for the company. And this is what some of the reasons companies, what they infuse diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging into their goals, into their vision of their company. So you can read through these statistics, but the key is this: companies who are diverse are overall making better progress, making more dollars, and the people that's involved in that company, they are feeling more like they belong. They feel like they more have a seat at the table. Therefore, they feel like it's more equity. They feel like it's more inclusion, right? So these are some of the effects. And again, these can be used as KPIs or benchmarks as you go along. The reason I'm pointing that out is because you remember the statistic that says we just can't have inputs and we just can't have activities, right? We want the outcomes. And these are some of the outcomes we'll get and we can use as benchmarks as we go along. Another KPI, create a framework for DEI communications, 15 percentage points. Black employees' belief in their employees' commitment to diversity compared to white employees. So they only have a 15% belief, right? So what is that? We want our number to be higher. That could be a KPI. That could be a basis of a program. That could be a communication strategy. Again, we want to infuse different things based on whatever the company feels is going to help them move forward and to help their employees move forward. Next. Another key data point. 26% of organizations have gender representation goals. So if you only have 26% of organizations have gender representation goals, then the flip side is what? We want that number to be bigger. So we want it to be 70, 80% have gender representation goals. That again can be a KPI for the industry, that could be a KPI for the company, that could be a KPI for the particular department. Next key data point. 21% of organizations have a senior role fully dedicated to DEI. Only 21%. So what's the opposite? You want to get that number up, what, to 50, 60, 70% of organizations that have a senior role fully dedicated to DEI. Again, it can be an industry standard, it could be a company standard, it could be an individual department or infrastructure standard that we can use to determine our progress as we move forward. Next key data point. 16% of organizations take an intersectional approach to understanding employees' experiences. What does that mean? 84% don't. All right. So we're getting it. So what we're showing is we have these data points, we have these opportunities for improvement, we have these opportunities for growth. And what each individual company has to say is what's important to us, or where are we lacking, or where is the room for improvement as we move forward with these efforts. I think it's our last key data point. 30% of organizations analyze promotions by race of ethnicity, right? Again, we want this number to always go towards the positive so that we can show that we're making the gains that these frameworks is supposed to have as we move through this particular space. Now, we talked about diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. Well, what's the opposite of that? Sometimes it's easier to see the opposite than it is, excuse me, to see the direct approach. So marginalization and intolerance is the opposite of diversity, equity, inclusion. We put this in here to show that if you're an employee that feels marginalized, or you feel like you're not being tolerated, you as an individual, right, may not be in a company that appreciates diversity, equity, inclusion. Then you have to make a determination as to whether or not you can move forward, or whether you want to take some action within the company in order to move the company in another direction. Now, from a company perspective, if you're getting these complaints that I feel marginalized, I don't feel like I'm being seen or heard, those things, then you have to think to yourself as a company, right? What can I do to rectify these situations? So seeing it from the diversity, equity, inclusion standpoint, but then the opposite side is marginalization and intolerance is the opposite of DEIB. Diversity inclusion trends for 2023. Now, we saw in 2021 where the trends were. And these are some trends that are going in the right direction. An evolving remote workforce, enabling diverse gender identity and gender expression, a multi-generational workforce, eliminating unconscious bias in the workplace, gearing up for systematic change. What are we saying? We're trending in the right direction. We're going in the right direction, but it's going to take you, I, and all organizations to keep this trend moving, so whereby in the future, all of our KPIs, all our key performance indicators continue to move in the right direction. And one day we'll have more diverse equity, inclusion, belonging organizations than we do have now, or moving towards that space. Diversity, inclusion. Again, we're hiring diversity professionals. We're increasing our transparency. We're supporting employees' mental health, and we're looking beyond tokenism. And one of the things that the pandemic brought about when we're talking about supporting employees' mental health, it really highlighted areas in diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging that focus on mental health. But remember, we talked about disabilities, and we talked about different things that have to do with your health. That's a diversity issue. That's the thing we have to work in. But as we see now, we're trending in the right direction. So just didn't want to put it out in a negative light, but giving it equal weight that, hey, there's work to do, there's ways to approach the issue, and we're doing better as we go along. So we've gone from our general area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now let's bring it some into the space of mentoring. So when we talk about mentoring now, as we evolve in this space, we're talking about critical mentoring. And what critical mentoring is basically is placing the youth in the center of all of the programs, all of the decisions, what's best for them, and seeing it from a youth-centric perspective. When we do this, it's going to challenge the norms, right, of some of the things that we've seen from an adult perspective and an institutional perspective. That way, right, we're able to create some more partnerships for youth in our communities to make what their dreams, their aspirations come through, not just from the standpoint of what we think is good for them, is what they think is good for themselves. In that way, we can move this ball forward in the future. Now, this is another framework. Now, let me take a pause. One of the things I want you to understand, we're giving the information from a 360 bird's eye view, and we're looking down through that lens. What we will ask that you do as you see areas that you can use for your organization, as you can use for your individual, then if you need to go deeper in that, you may have to do some additional research for a particular area. But we're providing the frameworks, we're providing terminology, we're providing a way to look into this space so that you can make some decisions as you go along. So taking the diversity, equity, and inclusion and placing it within the mentoring space, right, through a critical mentoring lens, these are some of the things in the critical mentoring space that will help our youth move forward in this particular area. Now, this is part of the end game. If we can get our youth focused on some of these issues of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging now, as they grow, as they progress in society, then hopefully automatically we're going to get a better society, a better picture of who we can be as diverse individuals as a whole, and through individual things that we can do. So 4 things we want to look at in terms of critical mentoring: the critical social analysis aspect for youth. We have also the collective identification analysis for youth. We have political self-efficacy or motivation from the standpoint of youth, and critical action. What are we talking about? From a social standpoint, right? All the ways that youth can get involved in social issues and even political issues, if you will, so that they can start to formulate some mentalities, some critical thoughts about how they can engage in society through this particular lens. When we talk about collective identification, we can take a group of youth that are similarly situated, that are similarly identify with each other, and that can be a way that we can infuse some of these principles with our youth. Then getting our youth involved in the political system, right, at a young age, because I know individuals myself that don't participate in the political system, but I think, personally, in my opinion, that's the wrong way to go about change. The more we can be involved in this system, the more we can have impact in towards moving this ball along. And finally, critical action. We need our youth, right, to take the action needed in order to move from where they are to where they need to be, right? To let them know they can be doing, have anything they want, but it's going to take some action. And this is going to be part of, here we go, when we have our mentors and we bring our mentors in and we're training our mentors and we're looking through the lens of what's important for our organization, how can we have our mentors work with our youth in these particular areas. Could be one framework, it could be a particular framework for each particular space. These are some things that we're going to have to work with our mentors. This is a summary of the 4 areas that I just talked about. Again, you may need to do some additional research based on your particular organization, based on your goals, your mission, those things. And the reason I keep always mention your mission, always mention your goals and your vision, because each organization is different. And each organization is going to have a different approach to this area of diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging that's going to work for them. And some things they need, some things they don't. Some things they do well, some things they don't. But as you move from the general to the specific to the mentoring to the programs, then these things are going to come through, and primarily through the training of your mentors to be ready to work through these things with the mentees. So the activity, we talk about the social interactions, we talk about the relationship, the personal ties that prescribe the mentoring relationship and the mentoring activity, but it's going to have to be some activity and intervention. I love the fact that now that mentoring is evidence-based intervention that shows that youth that have mentors, their behaviors, their negative behaviors go down, their self-esteem goes up, their communication get better, they do better in school. It has all of these positive effects, and it's not just hugs, right? We used to think it's just hugs, but now we know, excuse me, we know it's an evidence-based intervention using intentional efforts by the mentoring program or agency to promote, here we go, these mentoring activities. We just talked about 4 of them, talking about specific groups and communities. So these are some things you want to focus on in building your youth's critical consciousness, and it's going to come through the training of the mentors and of those involved with your organization. What is clear, looking across all of these studies, is that mentors are faced with 2 critical tasks, because the mentors is the one that work through with our mentees. Engaging young people in critical reflection, right, is this critical mentoring, engaging young people in critical reflection, questioning, and combining that with the supported action. So once mentors help the youth see the world with new eyes, they must then use that gift in a meaningful and empowering ways. This is moving from diversity, equity, inclusion, moving down through to critical mentoring. And now we're going to move into some more specific frameworks for diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and youth mentoring.
Thank you, Dwayne.
All right, August.
All right. My name is August Haven. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. I'm going to share a little bit more about how some of these concepts that Dwayne talked about can show up in mentoring programs in our organizations, and then some of the things that we can maybe do to combat kind of the impact that things like, for instance, white supremacy, ableism, anti-LGBTQ values and oppression, how we mitigate that in our workplace. So there is a lot of content here. I do not claim to be an expert in all of these areas by any means. I'm just going to share some kind of resources and some frameworks that have been really, really helpful and valuable for me in my own learning, and hopefully they'll be relevant for you as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about anti-racism, the pillars of white supremacy culture, and then antidotes to those, LGBTQIA+ affirmation and mentoring, neurodiversity and disability justice, how that can show up in mentoring, and then a little bit of discussion on microaggressions and microaffirmations as a way to just kind of create a sense of safety that's built into the culture of our organizations and our programs, and then some takeaways, and then I'm going to pass it to Naomi for additional resources. So anti-racism in mentoring. Anti-racism is defined as a process of actively countering the existence and impact of all forms of racism, including personal, interpersonal, systemic, and structural. So in mentoring, this requires things like just acknowledging and confronting racism as it shows up, colorism as it shows up, and then understanding kind of the compounding impact that multiple marginalized identities can have, and being sensitive to mitigating that, and making kind of conscious efforts, what Dwayne was talking about, kind of the KPIs, building some really clear goals around efforts to mitigate the impact of marginalized identities and kind of how society responds to those. And then facilitating youth and mentor critical consciousness, and then supporting positive identity development in youth, helping youth feel, a sense of value for exactly who they are.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then thank you, Dwayne. I like the agreement.
Oh, okay, I didn't know you hear me. All right.
It's nice that you're muted. You can stay muted.
Yeah, I'm paying attention.
What an attentive student. Thank you. Involving mentors and mentees as active agents and partners. So, one of the things that we talk about here is kind of the shift in power dynamics, and kind of not wanting to really operate with very centralized power. And so making sure that you're involving people at all levels of a programming, all the way down to mentees themselves, and kind of some decision making. a few statistics. So there is some research about why mentoring relationships are kind of discontinued before the originally agreed upon time. And some of those have a real direct tie to kind of not having a good, not being well equipped in some of these areas of DEI. So things like mentors being unaware of biases, negative stereotypes that they might be having, and that making it difficult to kind of bridge some of the cultural differences with their mentees. There are some studies that show that, those who have experienced shorter term relationships were more likely to express some racist views about the youth that they were working with and their families. And then you can kick it to the next slide as well. Because in contrast, there is evidence that shows that longer term relationships between mentors and mentees can really do a lot to kind of help cultivate critical consciousness among mentors so that they better understand kind of some of the issues that their mentee is facing, particularly when there are kind of differences in like racial or ethnic identity. And then also there is evidence that shows that folks who have really long-term mentoring relationships, the mentor ends up being more involved in activism and advocacy, and it kind of can fuel and motivate some kind of political participation as well.
Wow.
Okay, I do just want to give a little bit of framing around these pillars of white supremacy before jumping in. So these are developed by an author and educator and activist named Tema Okun, and she developed and published a lot of work on white supremacy culture and its impact, and then antidotes to that. And she is a white, or at least white presenting woman who does a lot to kind of credit folks who are involved in kind of her own education and formation as an activist. And she really published this as a way to kind of own her participation and even benefit from kind of the impact of white supremacy. So some of the people that she credits are Sharon Martinez, Kenneth Jackson Jones, and then the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, which has a pretty in-depth workshop and a lot of robust kind of resources around anti-racism. These pillars are not comprehensive. They're contextual, so they're meant to be kind of in our US context and the way that kind of race and whiteness plays out in our particular time and our particular country. And it's specifically tied to kind of middle or upper class whiteness. Okay, so with that long disclaimer out of the way, some of these pillars, they're the first one here about perfectionism. So, some of the antidotes here are really just a culture of appreciation where efforts are recognized and celebrated authentically, having kind of a learning organization where mistakes are invited even and kind of viewed as just an opportunity to learn. And when organizations can kind of demonstrate, and even supervisors can demonstrate an ability to separate a mistake from a person, that can be kind of one of these antidotes to perfectionism. Okay, another pillar that she talks about is the pillar of the sense of urgency. So having realistic work plans and productivity expectations, moving with a very long-term impact in mind and not kind of hyper fixating on short-term results. Wellness above productivity is huge. So kind of not making sure you're not compromising, a staff member or mentor's wellness for the sake of wanting results. And then a willingness to shift timelines as needed. So kind of an openness to change. And, I do want to mention too, the sense of urgency also can play out pretty frequently and pervasively when particularly white people in this context, or, whatever a privileged group of people might be in any given, fight for kind of justice for a marginalized identity, there can be a real sense of urgency to kind of swoop in and fix things and want to kind of correct mistakes, maybe out of guilt, maybe out of just kind of like a newfound awareness of some inequities. And I think at its core, that can be a good intention, but, it does kind of dismiss some of the depth of this work. And so I do just want to name how that sense of urgency can show up beyond just kind of our workplaces and into the social justice arena as well. Defensiveness. So some of the antidotes to defensiveness are understanding the link between defensiveness and fear. So if you're demonstrating defensiveness, it's because you feel a need to defend something. So kind of taking a pause to analyze, what am I afraid of? What am I scared of losing? Is it power? Is it losing face? Is it losing my comfort? Is it losing privilege? So just kind of taking a pause to, really understand and answer that question for yourself before getting caught up in a response of defensiveness. And then celebrating and facilitating open dialogue when conditions allow, and then discussing ways that, maybe defensiveness was demonstrated, taking some time to debrief that, to own it, to apologize, to gather feedback from other people on kind of how you can show up differently. Next. Quantity over quality is the next pillar that Tema Okun talks about. So this is really just, making even what Dwayne was talking about with KPIs, I think is really relevant here because it helps you create goals that are a little bit more process oriented. So not being kind of, again, hyper fixated on an end result, but making some kind of scaffolding goals for yourself can be very helpful. And that can be applied, even in or like organizationally wide, I think, particularly around DEI efforts, because you're not going to be able to fix kind of the impact of, the water that we're swimming in and all of the inequities that are very systemic. We're not gonna be able to fix that overnight. And so building really realistic and feasible goals around that can be helpful. And then also just ensuring that, organizations have a value statement that expresses how they want to do the work and not just what they want to do. So really putting some investment and care into kind of acknowledging quality in a way that it won't be compromised by just trying to get a certain numbers met or deliverables met. Next. Okay, worship of the written word. So this one's interesting because I do just want to give one kind of disclaimer that, because Tema Okun was situated in our own kind of, national context in the States, this can look different depending on kind of what culture you're from. But she was particularly talking about, things like Indigenous communities here can have a very different way that they relate to the written word, and like things like oral traditions and the way that stories are passed down. And so, those dynamics are very prevalent in kind of the way that Tema Okun was particularly talking about how a pillar of white supremacy is kind of an overvaluing of the written word. And a way that this can show up is just kind of, an antidote is like making sure that all of the messaging and kind of anything that is written down, there's just an accessibility component to it. So like analyzing what are we writing down inside and outside of our organization, who has access to that? Is that understandable to them? Is that inviting to them? Or could the way that we use written word as a program, as an organization, as a mentor, as a supervisor, could that end up kind of unintentionally being a gatekeeping effort? Yeah, so just kind of making sure that there's inclusion in the way that we're using written word. Okay, only one right way. So some of the antidotes to this one are accepting that there are many ways to get to the same goal. I like this one a lot because I can have kind of a strong personality and like things to be done a certain way sometimes, or know that I work best if I'm trying to do something a certain way. But there is a lot of value in just kind of letting things be a group decision. And especially when that feels kind of challenging to whatever our initial instinct was about the right way to do the thing. And so there can be value in intentionally releasing it and just kind of seeing what happens. And then, acknowledging that we have learning to do and that there is just as much value and validity in someone else's idea of how to do something as our own. And so this is very, very relevant in mentoring programs when it comes to just involving mentees and mentors in decision-making, uplifting their own lived experience, and recognizing that and giving it credibility as expertise. And then whenever possible, involve those who are most impacted by a decision into the decision making. Paternalism. This one is can be quite prevalent in in our sector. So this is kind of, some antidotes to this are really ensuring that everyone knows and understands who makes decisions in an organization, because there can be situations where effort and time and energy and resources and skills are put into something, and then something is stopped before it can get implemented, and that can be really discouraging. So ensuring that there's clarity kind of in those power dynamics from the beginning, ensuring everyone understands their role, their level of responsibility, what authority they have in an organization, and then once again, really including the people most affected by decisions in decision making. And so really kind of at its core, it's just like decentralizing power is the antidote. Okay, either or thinking. So one, just kind of on a personal level, notice the use of either or language, making conscious effort to find more than two alternatives. So notice kind of how binary is built into the way that we think, the language that we use, and challenging that for ourselves. And then notice how that can show up as kind of oversimplifying really complex issues, particularly when stakes are high, when it seems like there's urgency. There can be a temptation to kind of, rush forward with one decision, as thinking this is the only possible option right now because I'm stressed out or whatever the case may be. And so, taking a moment just to kind of step back, gather input from others as time allows, and just kind of be a little bit more thoughtful about what other options are there, so that you're not locking yourself into just only this or this. Power hoarding. So antidotes to this can include sharing power, really is the antidote. So, organizations can develop things like value statements, make sure that whatever communicated values that the organization is kind of, posting more publicly, making sure that those are actually embedded into processes and into practices, because there can sometimes be discrepancy between what an organization's messaging is about its values and then how that plays out in practice. Discussing what good leadership is. So asking for feedback on kind of what is a leadership style that maybe your mentors or your staff or your youth workers, what is the leadership style that they desire, that they thrive under, asking them about what their ideas of good leadership are, and then keeping focus on the mission. So not about individual success, but kind of letting there be participation and kind of shared, celebration for accomplishments as well. Fear of open conflict. So if there's the opportunity, plan for how conflict can be handled before it arises. This can be extremely relevant working with youth, because we model things for kids. We teach them how to be an adult. We teach them how to have conversations. We teach them how to navigate conflict by doing it because they're watching. And so distinguishing things like distinguishing between being polite and kind of avoiding really hard issues can be helpful, because there can tend to be a lot of what ends up just being policing, and kind of the expression of people's personalities, how they communicate, and sometimes that can be interpreted as aggressive, use a stereotype, or that can be interpreted as being hard-headed, or starting conflict where there shouldn't be any. So kind of challenging what are our preconceived ideas about that, and making sure that we are not kind of imposing our own cultural kind of limitations and rules of expression onto other people in a way that might not match theirs. So basically a receptiveness to open conflict with kind of the boundary of safety. Individualism. Utilize teamwork and collaborative approaches whenever possible. So people can be bigger than the sum of their parts. So acknowledging that sometimes when you're able to work with other people, the result is kind of exponentially better and can be larger than what each individual brings to the table. And then ensure organizations are working towards shared goals. So make sure that, if you're leading a team, you're not the only one who defines success and who defines what goals are. And then kind of everyone else trying to strive and meet those, making sure that that's very collaboratively defined. And then create a culture where, people are able to be receptive to accountability, where there are spaces to provide that feedback, where there's kind of a shared sense that we're in this together, we're striving towards a shared goal that we all have ownership over. And then if possible, when possible, kind of the invitation to check ourselves along the way and for others to check us to make sure that we're working towards that. Okay, objectivity is the next pillar. So some antidotes to this are acknowledging that everyone has a worldview. Full stop. Everyone has a worldview, and that worldview affects how they show up. I do, you do, Dwayne does, Naomi does. And it can get uncomfortable when, the way that we see somebody's worldview influencing how they express themselves. It can get uncomfortable when that kind of challenges our own, because our worldview can feel very personal. We can at times be passionate about it, depending on kind of what it's founded in. Things like religion can end up being, big motivators for worldview. If there's a way that a person is that can challenge our worldview in that way, then it can feel personal very quickly. And so just being able to take a step back and assume that everyone has a valid point, and our work is to really understand what that is. And last but not least, the last pillar that Tema Okun talks about is the right to comfort, which this one there are articles about and resources about and trainings about, particularly the way that the right to comfort kind of shows up for in whiteness, but particularly like white women, and the way that they can show up in organizations and programs in the world. And so understanding that discomfort is at the root of all growth and learning. And so working to relate with kind of a welcoming posture towards discomfort can be really helpful. And then deepening your political analysis of racism and oppression to develop a strong understanding of how personal experience and feelings might fit into the larger picture. And then my own addendum and kind of note here is that basically white people don't take everything personally. Not everything is about us.
Right.
So acknowledging that just because you might feel uncomfortable, there are times where that can be centered and can be the thing that is kind of being discussed and being unpacked and being held. But most often, that doesn't really have a place to be centered in the context of large systemic inequities.
Okay.
And so being able to kind of take some ownership over your discomfort, find another place to put that, and be willing to sit with the discomfort to be able to hold kind of a very real oppression and marginalization that someone else might be sharing or having in the same space.
That's good.
Okay, and then just some things for discussion here. Think about kind of what of these pillars stand out? What do you see as maybe prevalent in your organization? What do you feel personally challenged by? What is there one of these that you kind of want to work on adopting or working to change in the way that it shows up in your organization? So just to think about. Okay, moving on. LGBTQ plus affirmation in youth mentoring. This is really just kind of a recommendation to dig further into this resource. This gender unicorn is a really, really cool image because everything is on the spectrum. And that is why I love the gender unicorn. It acknowledges that everything from gender identity to gender expression to physical attraction to emotional attraction, everything is on a spectrum, and really no one person sits at the exact same kind of plot in every single one of those axes. And so it just acknowledges that everything is a little bit more complicated than maybe we are taught that it is. Neurodiversity and disability justice. So disability justice is a framework that was developed by some disabled women of color. Mia Mingus is one of kind of the people that coined that word. And she's based in the Bay Area of California and has done a lot of work around transformative justice and the way that disability justice is kind of a framework that opposes white supremacy as well. So it really just understands that all bodies are unique, essential, and equally valuable. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met, and that applies for people who are perceived as able-bodied and to people who are disabled. We all have needs, and we all have strengths. We are powerful not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. And then all bodies are confined by ability in some way, and by race, and by gender, and by sexuality, and by all of these different kind of identities. We're all situated somewhere within those. Okay, and then intersectionality and kind of the compounded marginalization factors. So, you know, the histories of white supremacy and ableism are extremely intertwined. And you can only really understand ableism by tracing it back to things like the heteropatriarchy, cis heteropatriarchy, colonialism, even capitalism, and kind of our productivity standards. So the same oppressive systems that inflict violence upon Black and brown bodies are those same systems that inflict violence upon, you know, bodies and minds that are deemed outside of the norm. And these systems really just kind of condition us to see that one type of person is normal, which is kind of the core thing that disability justice is trying to basically dismantle. That who decided that, who defines that, and how do we stop seeing different as dangerous? Okay, so microaggressions and microaffirmations. Microaggressions are defined as everyday, subtle, sometimes subtle, intentional, and oftentimes unintentional interactions or behaviors that communicate some bias against marginalized groups. And so doing a little bit of work around how can your organization, your program, you as a person in the way that you speak with people, how can you demonstrate and communicate microaffirmations and micro supports? So that's, considered kind of a small gesture that just acknowledges inclusion and care. It shows that you're listening. It shows that you understand, that there's some awareness of kind of how maybe the way that I show up as a white person, the impact of that, and how I am situated at a different, kind of access to things and benefit from this system that, other people in the same room as me might not. And then you can kick it to the next slide because there are just going to be a few examples of ways that we could do this. So, I'm going to kind of talk about how this could show up to combat a few of these different areas that we've talked about related to DEI, but really it's just kind of an encouragement to see what makes sense for your organization, for your program, for your context. Ask mentors, ask mentees, what would feel meaningful to them? What do they look for as kind of a safety cue when they walk into a space? And then adopt those. So I'm gonna give some examples, but the caveat that really ask the people that you work with. So things like hanging a Black Lives Matter flag, basic 101, just kind of a communication of like, hey, I'm on your side, I see you. Celebrating Juneteenth and other non-white centric holidays. So, people get 4th of July off, but sometimes organizations don't give Juneteenth off. So kind of acknowledging the discrepancy there. Requiring anti-racism training for staff and mentors. Again, basic 101, kind of whatever, it could be more in-depth, but whatever makes sense for you, kind of depending on the populations that you're primarily working with. Mm-hmm. And then ensuring intake forms have inclusive language. So letting participants kind of self-identify what their race and ethnicity is and making sure that you're not fitting people into boxes unintentionally just because those are the only options that you're giving people. Next. So a way that this can show up for LGBTQ+ mentors and mentees is adding pronouns to email signatures, to Zoom name, to your name tag if you're working in person, and to in-person introductions. So when you say your name, say your pronouns, because it just acknowledges that, like, just because I might present myself in this way and people might make certain assumptions about me, about what my pronouns are because of that, people who take the time to still say their pronouns at least acknowledges that just because I look a certain way and I use a certain set of pronouns doesn't necessarily mean I'm assuming that you do. And so it gives people permission to tell you who they are, essentially. So things like asking your mentors and mentees what their name and pronouns are, asking if there are kind of boundaries around where you're allowed to use that name and pronouns. And sometimes, it's not safe for kids to use a certain set of pronouns with a parent, but they really want their mentor to use that set of pronouns with them. So asking those questions to make sure that you kind of essentially giving the mentee or whoever it may be the opportunity to tell you what feels safest for them. And then once again, kind of ensuring that any intake forms give people the opportunity to accurately tell you who they are. Next. Okay, so a way that this can show up to mitigate kind of some neurodiversity or some ableism, really, is having things like fidget toys, stimming toys available if you're in person. So if you're kind of having group interactions, having ways for people to kind of engage their bodies in a way that might help them pay attention. It just shows an acknowledgement that you understand that that's a thing and that's a need that some people have. Making sure that all the spaces that you use and that mentors are even meeting mentees in are accessible, because you may not know people's accessibility needs. And so making sure that those questions are asked before if there's the opportunity. And if there's not, or if it doesn't feel like you have maybe even a right to kind of ask, what somebody's limitations are, then just making sure that wherever you go is accessible, no matter people's access needs. And providing ways for multiple forms of engagement, so whether that's, sharing videos, podcasts, things that are like, if somebody is dyslexic and reading is difficult, making sure they have another way to access information. Okay, we can kick to the next one. This is a resource that my colleague Monica shared with me. It's called the Johari window. And this can be really helpful, particularly for kind of internal organization use. So like if they're, I guess mentors and kind of youth workers as well. It just is a form that you can send out to a coworker, and it has a list of a bunch of positive adjectives. And it gives them the opportunity to say, hey, August, here's what I see you demonstrating really well. And they just kind of click the ones that, yes, August is this, submit it. And then you can move to the next one. And then Monica developed this, this kind of table that shows, so after everybody submits it, then I fill out one for myself. And it helps build some self-awareness around, what do I think I am? And how does that compare with what other people think I am? So I might think that I'm, super adaptable, and other people agree, great. But there might be other ones where, maybe I think that I'm, let's use a real example. So things like the hidden self is something that that I rated about myself that no one else also kind of agreed with. So things like vulnerability and self-awareness. So it really can help cultivate those things. So things like being transparent, being wise, being knowledgeable, all those were things that people did not necessarily indicate about me with kind of the limit of adjectives they were able to express. And then people did say humble, optimistic, receptive, and those were things that I did not indicate about myself. So it can be really good just to kind of, do a self-awareness check about that. These are other really good tools to use in kind of building self-awareness. So the social identity wheel and the personal identity wheel, these are like my own results to this. So you essentially give it to people and let them fill out and kind of plot themselves on this pie related to a whole bunch of different things about identity. So social identity, that can include religion, that can include ethnicity, gender, legal status, etc. And if you place yourself on the kind of the inner sphere, that means that's an identity that's really salient to you, that you feel a lot. And if you place yourself on the outer sphere, that's something that maybe doesn't occur to you as much. And the real point here is that Oftentimes privilege is not something that's felt, but oppression is. And so it just gives you an image that kind of helps demonstrate that. Okay, I am going to pass it off to Naomi for some tools and resources.
Awesome. Thank you so much, August. So, hello, everyone. I am Naomi Rodriguez from Mentor New York. I just want to thank Dwayne and August for queuing and teeing me up for the small part that I give, but I hope to provide some tools and resources to apply to your organizations or corporations at large. So to start that off, it's essentially thinking about your systems of equity and evaluations that are done within youth mentoring programs and part of that design and inclusion. And so this is a part of a microlearning module that provides an introductory overview for some youth mentoring organizations. Its aim was developed for services and practices based on a racially equitable framework, and part of Mentor New York's Amplify Equity Toolkit that breaks down the complexity of impacting systems of equity into understandable and actionable steps. So I'm going to take you through the little micro modules so we can talk a little bit about it. But part of that is providing the fundamentals to begin the challenging process of valuing and proactively working on inclusion. And so this was actually created in collaboration with Dr. Noreen Stewart. She is the founder and CEO of Stewart Learning, and she helps to equip mentors, educators, parents, and students with the skills they need to prepare for life during and after high school. So she lovingly created this beautiful little micro module for us for Mentor New York. And part of that is the evaluation is crucial for creating programs that are inclusive and diverse background, that have diverse backgrounds and experiences. And part of that is to meet the needs of youth and families that may serve your organization, and understanding the lived experience is a range of life spheres, and that there needs to be a recognition that there's a multitude of social factors that impact an individual's relationship with privilege, discrimination, power, and oppression on a societal level. And that process includes examination of the conscious and unconscious bias. And especially the idea of how you evaluate your program. Are you taking that into consideration? And just like pi, it's a mathematical ratio of a circle to its diameter. And though the value is commonly approximated to 3.14, right? We have Pi Day, March 14th. It is in fact has a never ending and never repeating string of digits. And so like the human experience, there's infinite variations and unique combinations of life experiences and identities that do exist. So part of that is a little exercise on the next slide. And I want all of us to imagine, if you have to close your eyes for a second, imagine yourself at the beginning of a start line. And I want you to move forward if the statement is true or applies to you. And so if this is true, you would step forward during your schooling, kindergarten through advanced degrees. Most school principals and professors were the same race as you. Growing up, did you ever attend a private school or summer camp? You would step forward. Did one or both of your parents graduate from college? You would step forward. Or another question, do you typically see mentors of your race widely represented in the media in a positive manner? You would step forward. Since you were young, was there an expectation that you would attend college? And I'll leave you with the last question is, when you enter a business, is the person in charge usually your race? Okay, and part of this micro module, there's a lot more questions on it. So the next slide, now, I want you to imagine yourself where you are, whether you're still at the start line, whether you're way ahead, whether you're just still there. Now I want you to be where you are, and I would like you to step backward if the statement is true and applies to you. Have you ever been the only person of your race or ethnicity in a classroom or place of work? Did you grow up in an economically disadvantaged or single parent home? Have you been harassed, followed, or closely surveilled while shopping? Have you been called names because of your sexual orientation or gender identity? Have you or people you know ever been mistrusted without sufficient evidence? Examples, have you ever been accused of lying or stealing something? Next question is, have you ever been ashamed or embarrassed that you could not purchase essentials like food, a standard clothing item, school supplies? And have you ever been worried or nervous about speaking because of your accent or speech impediment? You would step backward. And again, there's more questions, of course. And so if you'd like to open your eyes, keep them closed. I think I want to kind of understand that there's a level set, the idea, and to consider in the next slide, that you have to remember your final placement on the path to success. They're derived from various factors, that you have a unique and rich story behind where you ended up on that path, right? And were there moments that you felt discomfort or unease during the exercise or the questions? How did it feel to take that step forward or step back? How can you apply what you experienced during the exercise to the work that you're doing to evaluate your current design of your organization's program? And part of that is the aims. And the aim of the exercise is really to broaden your view and perspective on individual vantage points. There's no right or wrong answers, only facts about your past, background, and previous experiences. So how does this enhanced awareness, kind of aspects of privilege, be used in mentoring organizations to create a more inclusive environment? And part of that is phases. And part of this framework, again, developed by Dr. Stewart, that you're able to develop that knowledge of racial equity, right? All of the things Dwayne and August kind of talked about. What are all of these things that you can consider for your programs, for the youth that you're mentoring? And then also the second phase of how you can engage youth, elevate their voice in a exploratory needs assessment. What are some needs that you're going to listen to? There's a little ear on the framework. So what are we hearing? What do we know? How do you obtain the data? Are we being accessible? Are we understanding how that's done to potentially people who cannot do an electronic form, right? What does that look like? How are you examining those systems that may be underlying cause of inequity? The next phase is that you determine the strategies and resources to target that. Are you looking for partnerships outside in the local community? Are you looking for consultants to come in and help you to assess what's happening? And also the impact that it would have as an organizational decision-making model. Like, what does that look like? And then how do you disseminate those findings and reevaluate as needed is a large part of those considerations as well. So you can move on to the next slide. And as I mentioned already, what are the things that made you uneasy? What are you able to remember as part of your path to success? And part of that is to know, how are you evaluating programs? Are you doing this in an equitable fashion? And so this is a little bit of a micro lesson of a module that we've worked on and that I'd like you all to consider, that you could take away and have the resource after the training that you could start doing as a group or team or leadership to think about these things. Were those moments of unease and discomfort during the exercise? Are you thinking of the young people that are within your population, thinking about the families that are within that? You know, all of these things that may be considered as part of that exercise to evaluate what's currently designed within your programs. And so another little resource that I wanted to share as well was this really great podcast about mentoring the immigrant community, right? It's an episode that's connected various resources and discussions. Usually when I talk to programs, I always recommend, what are your mentors listening to? What are they understanding? What is your organization talking about or listening to? Do you have, a group chat dedicated to sharing, resources, conversations that you're listening to? And part of that is knowing what's going on in the community. And this specific episode talks about mentoring in the immigrant community. So this is a quote directly from the podcast. Once I became a mentor, truly humanized everything I was hearing in the news, everything that I was passionate about. And I think it's truly because I kept an open mind and wanted to learn. So how are we continuously learning about things that are changing in the world? So I always recommend podcasts, people driving to work, people driving home, people going to take the dog for a walk. What are we doing to continuously learn? Is a big part of that. And so the next slide is a cultural competence self-assessment. It's a checklist. With a lot of self-assessments, again, it's hard work. You got to be true to yourself. You got to answer the hard questions that you maybe don't like about yourself. So this one is actually designed to explore cultural competence and to consider your skills, the knowledge, the awareness you have of yourself as a self-assessment, and the interactions you have with others. And with the term culture, maybe it's not culture related to race, ethnicity, ancestry, but also culture shared by people that may have characteristics in common. That can be people with disabilities, people who are part of the LGBTQIA plus community, people who are deaf, members of faith and spiritual communities. This is also different parts of culture to consider. Oh, and people of various socioeconomic classes as well. So it's not just the race and ethnicity, it's also the subgroups or the intersectionality that comes from this. And then this is another great assessment, workplace diversity assessment. Again, highly recommend for leadership to do this, employees to consider. Is there something happening within your workplace? Is it welcoming? So this workplace diversity assessment is part of 4 pillars: commitment, hiring practices, employees, partnerships, and supports. And so commitment can look like, is there a diversity statement that aligns with the company value that is communicated to employees? The hiring practices, is there any bias in hiring? Is diversity appropriately used in job advertisements? Is that, different postings? What does it look like in terms of language? And then employees, is there a welcoming work environment? Are employees just as invested in the diversity plan as management? Taking that into consideration as well. And then partnerships and supports can look like, are you connected to your local group or community? Are there people that are providing professional development for your staff to have these conversations that may be a little uncomfortable, but it's all part of knowing where to strengthen and create that inclusive workplace as well. And so again, almost my last slide is some additional resources. This was actually, a lot of what I'm talking about was actually made in partnership with Kamal from the Youth Advisory Board for the National Mentoring Resource Center. I greatly appreciate him and his help. And so he was able to pull some quotes for me of different resources as well that is available through post-training, essentially about mentoring immigrant and refugee youth, supporting students on the autism spectrum, and then also mentoring for LGBTQIGNC youth to take a look into, to share and always have people prepared and want to be curious learners even more. And then our references. So here are some references that we'd like to add in terms of the conversations we just had, so that everyone has access to this information and all of that. And I will pass it over to Jake.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, August, Naomi, and Dwayne for that really incredible, packed with information and resources and things that folks can dive further into after this. And then also explore some experiential learning activities and all of the various tools that you provided. Just very grateful for you all. We do have some additional resources. Of course, at any point, you can always email us with any feedback or questions at collaborative-webinar-series@mentoring.org. All folks here are part of some of our incredible mentor affiliates, and mentor affiliates can support with training, resources, public awareness, and advocacy. So if you click this link, again, these slides will be shared afterwards. You could find your local affiliate. We have the Mentoring Connector, which is a really incredible tool where you can post your mentoring, or you can have your mentoring programs post information about themselves, where folks can go in case they want to either find a mentoring program, be a mentor, and that's a database located on Mentor's website. Last but not least, we have the National Mentoring Resource Center, which is funded and in partnership with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, where you can access even more evidence-based mentoring resources and also apply for no-cost technical assistance and training.
Mm-hmm.
Remember, all of these slides, the recording resources will be posted on the CMWS webpage on Mentor's website after this. And then you can join us next time on December 21st, 1 p.m. to 2:30 p.m., where we'll be having another webinar, kind of a double feature moment in this month of December that will focus on lived experience mentoring with some of our partners over at Silver Lining Mentoring. So thank you all so much for tuning in. And thank you again to our incredible presenters and August, Naomi, Dwayne, and Kamal for putting this presentation together. Again, everything will be posted, so feel free to reach out if you have any further questions or follow-ups. But hope everybody has a wonderful day and take care.